Horror is one of those genres where it's basically required to have a twist of some sort. However, seasoned horror hounds can see most of these twists coming a mile away after years of ardent fandom. So let's take a look back at the twists new and old, which didn't just take us by surprise in the horror sphere, but blew our minds. Beware of Jupiter-sized spoilers for the following films. In both the original and remake of When a Stranger Calls, a babysitter is plagued by mysterious and harassing phone calls. As one of the most famous twists in horror history, this one would have been hard to avoid as a spoiler because even non-horror fans have absorbed and riffed on the storytelling trope. As the intensity of the calls increases, the babysitter contacts the police, who instruct her to keep the caller on the line as long as possible in order to trace the call. After a call where she engages with the creep as long as she can, the babysitter hangs up only to have the phone ring again immediately. The officer then frantically tells her that the call is coming from inside the house. If you were lucky enough to either experience this twist in 1979 or 2006 without an inkling of what was about to happen, the chill you would have gotten would have been stupendous. The twist in 2009's Orphan was good, sure, but if you ask me, prequel Orphan First Kill upped the ante and subverted what we all thought the movie would be about in a real shocker. As a prequel, First Kill shows very small, very psychotic 31-year-old Lena Klammer escaping an Estonian mental institution and assuming the identity of a missing American girl, Esther Albright. She is, quote, reunited with the wealthy Albright family in the States, and things seem to be so much so Orphan prequel. Then, when Lena is attempting to silence a suspicious detective looking into the girl's origins, Mother Tricia shows up and pumps the detective full of lead, explaining that she actually knew Lena is not the real Esther. As it turns out, Esther's brother Gunnar had killed the real Esther, which Tricia covered up to guard her husband's feelings. Lena's impersonation of Esther gave Tricia the hope that perhaps the family could finally heal. Truly, I didn't see this coming, and it was because I was focused on what would have been the obvious plot, which was Lena covering her tracks while the family slowly tried to uncover them. It was a very pleasant surprise, to say the least. After what was a fairly lackluster entry in The Final Destination, the fourth film of the franchise, Final Destination 5 brought the series back to smaller, less spectacular, but equally upsetting kills as Death attempts to balance its books on a group of people who escaped a suspension bridge collapse due to a premonition. Until this moment, the twist had always been the same in Final Destination films. Just when it seems like the final guys and gals had cheated death for good, death always wins. Hardly a twist when it's the same every time. What set 5 above the crowd is exactly how Death writes its books. Throughout the film, male lead and resident future seer Sam was contemplating the opportunity of going to Paris to be the head chef in a new restaurant. After the harrowing events of the film, he and girlfriend Molly decide to go to Paris together and start a new life with their newly found zest for living every day like their last. So, they board Flight 180 to Paris on May 13th, 1999. It is highly unlikely that you have seen Final Destination 5 without at least having seen the first film, so you likely know that Final Destination's tragedy was Flight 180 exploding on takeoff, killing all but 7 people who disembarked after a premonition of the explosion. Here's why this twist is more than just a throwaway tie-in. Final Destination 5 does an incredible job at hiding the fact that it's set in 1999 and not present day, which would have been 2011 at time of release. You see an old television set playing a dated corporate team-building video on the bus at the start, but that could easily be brushed off as cheap company BS. You don't really see cell phones except for on one character, and it's a janky flip phone, but all the characters work in the same office building, so there is rarely a point where you would think, why don't they just call the person they need to talk to, since they're constantly running into each other and interacting? It was very sneaky and well done, but that's not all. Final Destination 5 puts the entire series into a new light. Tony Todd's character, the mysterious mortician William Bloodworth, has a bigger role and offers quite a bit more information to the survivors of the bridge collapse. It also implies heavily that the explosion of Flight 180 was solely for the purpose of writing the survivors of the collapse. So, since Bloodworth seemed very knowing and withholding in the first Final Destination, all indications lean toward the bridge collapse being ground zero for the entire series, and Bloodworth is trying his best to let death take its toll. Think about it. Much like When a Stranger Calls, this twist is so well known, it's extremely unlikely you don't know about it, even if you haven't seen the film. But it is quite possibly the finest and best crafted twist in horror history, so we're going to cover it real quick. But seriously, if you haven't seen M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense and you don't know what I'm talking about, stop watching right now and go watch The Sixth Sense. Right now. I'm not kidding. A child psychologist played by Bruce Willis is assaulted in his home by a patient who believes the good doctor failed them, shooting the doc in the stomach. Time skips forward a way, and the psychologist comes into contact with a very troubled young man who, as the famous quote goes, sees dead people. It's established early on that some don't know they're dead. I don't think anyone still watching this is unaware of what happens. So yeah, Bruce Willis was dead the whole time, having succumbed off-screen to the gunshot from the beginning of the film. Of course, looking back, it makes perfect sense since no one but the little boy ever interacts with the psychologist, and it is, in my opinion, the most shocking twist in all of horror, and quite possibly all film in general. I was very fortunate not to have this spoiled, and my mind was properly blown exactly the way it was supposed to have been. Another mighty fine twist, which kicked off a grand tradition of betrayals and bonkers subversion, was the twist ending of 2004's Saw. Two men awake, chained in a dilapidated bathroom, photographer Adam and Dr. Lawrence, and there is a corpse which had apparently suffered a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head lying between them in the center of the room. Serial killer Jigsaw communicates with them via TV screen, tape recorder, and puppet, forcing the men to solve puzzles and sacrifice in order to prove their will to live. In the end, it's Dr. Gordon who finally takes the titular Saw to his foot, freeing himself from the chains and promising Adam to send help, crawling out of their makeshift prison. Then, accompanied by what is now one of the most iconic pieces of cinematic music in history, stringed instruments swell as the corpse on the floor, having laid there for the entire film, stands up and is shown to be none other than Jigsaw. Failing to have made a sacrifice and prove his will to live, Adam is closed in the room, in the dark, alone, forever. Nobody had any reason to believe that corpse was actually the killer, so even though it's a bit of an unnecessary twist in that Jigsaw didn't actually have to do that for his plan to work, the surprise combined with the score made for quite a memorable moment. And there you go, 5 of the finest horror twists in history. If you enjoy this kind of thing, check out Vengeance is Hers, which is on the greatest feminine revenge stories in horror. And this one here is about the most heroic dogs in horror film history. Enjoy, and I'll see you next time.